Welcome back to the Aggression in Dogs Conference. All of the talks are pre-recorded and played right here on the main stage. If you're having technical issues with the live presentation, a YouTube link will be provided in the chat box where you can watch the presentation in another browser window. Professional closed captioning is available by clicking on the CC button at the bottom of your video window. If you experience any other tech issues during the live presentation, please visit the info desk in the lobby or drop a question in the chat box. Information about continuing education credits, as well as a link to download PDFs of the presentation slides, can be found at the info desk as well. Stick around for a Q&A time right after, also here on the main stage. And just so you're aware, there will be a slight delay of about a minute or so between the presentation and the Q&A session. If you have questions for Kim, please enter them into the Q&A box so she can see them outside of the chat box. We also have lots of prizes to give away if you're attending the conference live. You can earn points for that contest by engaging in activities such as visiting our amazing exhibit hall. And don't forget to join us for our virtual cocktail party tonight at 7 p.m. Eastern Time, happening with our speakers right here on the main stage. So grab your favorite beverage and join in on the chat. And now I'm really happy to introduce our next speaker, Kim Brophey, who is an applied ethologist and owner of the Dog Door Behavior Center in downtown Asheville, North Carolina. Kim's 20-year commitment to family dog mediation has been recognized both nationally and locally, and she was awarded the Association of Professional Dog Trainers Outstanding Trainer of the Year in 2009 and the Best Dog Trainer of WNC 6 years in a row. She has lectured and taught courses at colleges, universities, and conferences on canine behavior, ethology, and welfare. Kim is a member of the International Society for Applied Ethology and the Association of Professional Dog Trainers, and is a past board member of the IAABC and current board member of the Asheville Humane Society. Kim's trademark dog legs model is a groundbreaking new system for dog lovers to truly understand their dog's behavior, distilling multiple scientific disciplines and established principles into a simple and accessible framework for pet dogs and their people like never before. Kim is also a guest instructor for the Aggression in Dogs Master Course, which you can find out more by visiting the aggressivedog.com booth in the exhibit hall. I've had the honor of knowing Kim for many years, and I'm so grateful that she's bringing the ethology lens to the Aggression Conference. Enjoy the talk.
Hi everyone, my name is Kim Brophey and this is Ethological Contributions to Aggression in Dogs. I'm really happy to be a part of this conference as I was to be part of Mike's course. And many of you may have already seen the module there. Hopefully, even though this is technically the same presentation, you'll get some new things out of it today as we make a much smaller version of this presentation in order to squeeze it into an hour. So with that said, let's jump on in and talk about ethology as it relates to dog behavior and specifically aggression. So ethology is pretty much just the study of animal behavior, and we usually talk about ethology in science as observing animals in their natural habitat. And so stepping away from just the purely kind of behaviorist lens of looking at behavior, we're looking at behavior in the context for which it was designed. So in other words, nature being this incredible system of checks and balances where every element is designed to work optimally in conjunction with all the other elements. Different species evolve to fill niches where there are certain opportunities and pressures in nature, and they find ways to adapt and survive to those changing circumstances that are unique to those environments. Both as individuals and their own learning throughout the course of their life and development, and then also genetically as they literally are changed by their experiences, which is pretty incredible. Epigenetics is something we could go down a rabbit hole about, but literally we're changed by our experiences and we pass on that information to our offsprings. There are, of course, mutations and variations genetically within each generation that offer new experimental opportunities to see see how well something works, and if we have the design behaviorally and physically to operate effectively on our environmental conditions in order to survive and reproduce, then those things will be passed on. But what's really awesome about looking at things through an ethological lens is you really are having to step back and look at all of the elements that are contributing to what we're observing in a given moment in the behavior of an organism. I think that one of the things that has happened in our industry is that we have kind of put dogs in this kind of a black hole or a limbo between the natural world and the human world, because all of us have been born into a world in which dogs were effectively pets, at least in modern industrialized countries like the United States. So when we're talking about dog behavior, we look at them like pet dogs. And for us, we didn't experience in our own lifetime, at least most of us, the context for which dogs were selected for all of these different purposes historically. So it seems like there's just a lot of different shapes and sizes and versions, colors, designs, etc. of dogs. And we kind of lump them all together into this dog bucket, and we forget that they are biological animals too, that are the result of the pressures of selections historically. Even if those pressures were artificial and done by human hands, they are still affecting dogs in very complicated ways, in the same way that they would be for an animal in their natural habitat in nature. So it's really important that we make sure that we don't leave the ethology piece out of our discussion of dogs. And so as captive animals, there are some differences that we need to think about that move us just slightly off of the center conversation of ethology into another more specialized field. That field is called applied ethology, and applied ethology is a very small scientific discipline, much larger in Europe than it is in the United States. It's very underrepresented here, but applied ethology is specifically concerned with the relationship between human and animals behavior in captive and domesticated species. So most applied ethologists are actually studying animals in farms, in agriculture, in zoos, laboratories even, with the smallest number of applied ethologists studying companion animals. And I think that may be in quite accidental in many ways, because we don't think of companion animals in modern industrialized countries where they are pets as being captive animals that are having welfare issues. We forget that. We think it's all privilege and luxury for them to not be living on the streets as they are in 80% of the world where they're still free roaming. And so the whole consideration about, what's going on in this particular relationship between people and animals in these captive environments where there are these pressures, where we have removed the natural autonomy for the animal to make all of their own choices, where we are in control of their access to everything in the environment, really, and oftentimes have put them in environmental conditions that are a far cry for what they were designed for in the first place. So that creates a host of complicated issues as we go to interact with that animal, and particularly to cohabitate with that animal. So there's this really wonderful kind of nutshell term in ethology and in biology called phenotype. And phenotype is this great term for describing the complete set of all the observable characteristics and properties of an animal that result from the interaction of the animal's genotype, their genetic composition, as well as their environment, as well as how they're also learning and adapting in that environment as they develop throughout the course of their life. So it is both what we might observe an animal actually doing, as well as the resultant product of their work, for instance, building nests, dens, and things like that. So think of phenotype as being the whole picture, the big picture of the interaction between nature and nurture. I hope we're all on the same page at this point, with science having proven over and over again that it is neither nature or nurture that is responsible for behavior, but it is the constant interplay of both of those things for all species. Even when natural selection is not at the helm, but it's artificial selection that is largely designing the behaviors that we might be observing. So one of the things that I have put together through the course of my career to try to make this a little easier to talk about with each other and also with clients is the legs model. And that is learning, environment, genetics, and self. And what's handy about the legs model is that it makes it a little more digestible and easier to organize all of these different variables that will contribute to an animal's behavior, so we don't get overwhelmed or kind of lost in the weeds, so to speak. So if we're working any behavior case, particularly an aggression case, and we're really trying to understand what's going on, we can say, yes, of course, everything matters. We know that their genetics will contribute something. We know that the environment is going to affect the animal's behavior, all the various antecedents, both immediate and more distant antecedents. And we also know that they are learning and adapting, can learn new skills. We can modify behaviors. We know that sex is going to matter, and that age and health and disease, injury, all of these things are going to influence behavior. But it's really easy to just feel so overwhelmed by the body of all the things that matter. So legs is meant to be a way just to kind of give us little checkpoints and ways of thinking about, like, okay, so in terms of the learning, what do I need to think about for this particular animal, this particular dog in our case? In terms of the environment, what do I need to think about? In terms of the genetics, what do I need to think about? And then in terms of the self, which is that kind of individual set of unique characteristics that are one in a million to that specific dog. So, who that dog is as an individual with their own personality and experiences and their own vault, their unique interior world and their health, their development, whether they're socially mature, sexually mature, whether they are, actually ovulating or nursing puppies, or recovering from an injury, or starting to lose their hearing or eyesight. All of those things are going to matter as well. So instead of trying to talk about phenotype, which is not necessarily the handiest term when we're working with our clients and the public, we can just say, okay, so we have this legs model that just helps us make sure that we stay on track and we keep all these things in mind, because all of it will matter. And oftentimes we are really misunderstanding and misdiagnosing behaviors with these kinds of labels that have become popular in our field, because we're lumping all the dogs together and really leaving out particularly the interaction between the dog and their environment. So let's talk about this for a minute. In my experience, mostly where we are really missing out and failing to put the pieces together is going to be in the genetics and the environment and the relationship between those things. So let's think about this for a second. If you have any animal in nature out in the wild, then their genetics are really created by generations of selections for function. So nature doesn't really care, in other words, what something looks like, but the morphology is the physical characteristics are related to the behaviors that animal is needing in order to operate successfully on their environment and adapt and reproduce. So, for instance, if you need to be faster in order to catch a certain type of prey, then your pressures for selections in nature are going to pick things that make you more fleet of foot and better at turning on a dime and being able to catch that particular animal. If it's more about tenacity and the ability to get into small places, then your design is going to over generations change in that direction based on who out of the population is most effective at pursuing those opportunities or avoiding certain threats. And so the pressure is really behavioral, is the point that I'm trying to make. And the morphology kind of comes on the back of that. But those two things are not unrelated to each other. So Darwin's whole finch study is a great example of this, and basically, like, the different kinds of foods that were available on the different islands for the Galapagos finches created all of these different little subspecies of these finches with different types of beaks that could functionally access and then break open or be able to consume different types of food sources depending on the shape of their beak, their bill. And so when we're looking at dogs, we want to realize that, like, the things that we're seeing that are morphologically related to these different genetic groups of dogs, they're not accidental. They're not just random. I mean, recently we've been breeding much more in the last 100 years or so for particularly physical physical attributes, but largely historically humans were breeding dogs for specific behaviors, and then the morphology came on the back of that. So when an animal is in the right habitat, these things work really well in concert, so they have these particular physical and behavioral design templates. Behaviorally, you can think of a lot of that like there are latent programs that might be sitting on like your software or like software on your computer that you don't notice until life clicks start on the program and it opens up and runs that program. And then you have this whole software program that was just sitting there inactive until the right conditions turned it on. And so neuroethology is a whole subfield that you can go down a rabbit hole looking into about all the different types of environmental stimuli that different species are selected to notice and respond to in specific ways, and thinking about how we are wired, each of us and each species, subspecies, dog, group of dog, breed of dog, etc., to notice certain things and ignore other things depending on those selective pressures in the environment and the habitat and whatever they were selected for. And so you really want to think about this whole idea of a lock and a key, and that in nature, nature would always have this kind of checks and balances system about making sure that the right design fits the habitat and that the habitat is fitting the design, or that animal would just be selected against and then out of the population. And so what you really need to think about in terms of what we do for a living and working with dogs as behavior consultants and trainers is that we are working with all of these dogs in the 21st century that are not living in the environmental habitats for which they were selectively bred, with herding dogs being kind of the wonderful poster child for this. So you have a lot of drive, you have a lot of work ethic. These dogs are capable of and wired to work long days, organizing other individuals, very sensitive to sudden environmental contrast, very responsive to sudden environmental contrast, with an urge to do something to reconcile any kind of variations to the status quo in a particular environment. Highly athletic, highly concerned with law and order and structure and organization, and quite different than the kind of quintessential Labrador that many of us, have also met and worked with, where they can kind of go with the flow and things roll off of them more readily because they're just not bred for this level of intense function and job drive that herding dogs are. So I want to talk about that because these pictures here are really giving us an example of like what these behaviors look like in their appropriate context. And so, herding sheep is what we've bred a lot of herding dogs to do, or herding livestock, jokingly bouncing off of trees, but many of you have seen similar such versions, behaviors of these dogs bouncing off of walls, but having parkour mad skills nonetheless that work really well when you have a 50-acre farm and a bunch of livestock, and not so well when you're living in a high-rise condo in downtown Manhattan. And stalking positions, nipping behaviors, etc. These things are really adaptive in the right conditions. They're really useful in the right conditions. They helped humans adapt and survive to our own pressures over the millennium. And now in the modern world, very few dogs have the opportunity to express the behaviors for which they were bred, and that creates behavior problems. But it doesn't mean that the dog has a disorder. It means that you're really having an issue between the lock and the key, between the things not working together. So when we look at what the wrong versions of these behaviors look like, we might have a dog that's herding toddlers in a family room and is very stressed by the amount of activity and stresses and variations, lack of organization, lack of predictability, lots of sudden environmental contrast. If you have small kids in the house, that they're kind of the very definition of sudden environmental contrast. And so when we see behavior like, aggression towards children because the dog is biting their ankles, and growling when the kids, run across the room with Nerf guns shooting their siblings, and then barking sharply and running circles around them and maybe landing a few bites. We look at that as if it's like abnormal behavior and this dog should be put on Prozac, or even if it's not children, right? Even if we have people coming into the house, everything's fine as long as all the ducks are in a row and everyone's just sitting down having dinner, someone knocks on the door and walks into the house without you inviting them and going through a certain protocol that this dog sees as orderly and acceptable. So there's a sudden environmental contrast of an intrusion, and the dog reacts in a way that we're perceiving as humans to be aggressive, but is part of the selective force for what we bred herding dogs to do, which is control events in the environment, control other individuals in the environment. So we just have to start changing our perception and our language about those things by just appreciating that there is a fundamental problem there in terms of this animal being in an environment that is quite different for that which it was bred. So one of the things that I think is really important for us to talk about is we have to stay away from ideology in politics and extremes and black and white thinking in really anything, but it also relates to our careers and our work. And our industry, like many others, has been highly polarized and politicized in recent years. And there's all of these like things you're supposed to do and say and things you're not supposed to do and say. And oddly enough, with ethology getting thrown out like the baby with the bathwater in our field, what's happened is genetics has almost become like a dirty word. So I've been called a breed racist because I talk about genetics at all, because I talk about an animal's welfare needs or their natural behaviors or complications and pressures that can occur when we have the wrong genetics in the wrong habitat. And it doesn't mean that, you can't resolve those issues. It means you just have to appreciate them for what they are before you move forward. But I really need everyone to understand that this is a whole framework. It's not that genetics are predictive of behavior. They're just contributing. And they're contributing an immeasurable amount. And just like the learning and the environment and the self, it's not that we can say, well, genetics contributes 30%, and the learning contributes 20%. I mean, we don't know how much for each individual one thing is weighing in and influencing behavior over another. So our job is to just functionally understand and appreciate the pressures that each of these things contributes to the overall presentations of behavior that we're working with, and be able to understand when we do see a certain behavior, if it does make sense that that might have some genetic roots, then we need to adjust our expectations as well as the client's expectations about things that might be very much in that dog's, software or their hardwiring in terms of how they are going to perceive events in the environment and how they are going to respond to events in the environment. Because genetics, when those types of behaviors are activated, something that is an instinct as opposed to like a newly learned behavior that is more frontal lobe, more of a choice. And once something turns into a habit and you have a well run riverbed, right? We all know that any behavior that's become a habit starts skipping the filter of executive function. And that's the brain saving energy in the economy of behavior, saving energy so I don't have to stop and think and make a decision about what I'm doing. I just 90% of the time I'm operating from instinct and habit. Think of instinct as something with just generations of reinforcement history. That's a good way to think about it and still keep within the framework of the L where most trainers are comfortable talking about. It's just a very long reinforcement history. And so that's where epigenetics helps us understand how genes are literally changed, and the epigenetic tags are even created on the regulatory part of the DNA through experiences. And so that's a lot of really intense stuff that, again, we could get very lost in the weeds about. But I do want all of you guys to really understand that talking about genetics isn't bad. This is how we keep the interest of the animal at heart, and we have realistic expectations, and we can work with different dogs differently in terms of socialization, training, environmental management, etc., based on what those genes are. It gives us a really realistic starting point for moving forward in a behavior case, but they're not predictive. You can't say, all herding dogs will do this, and all terriers will do this, and all guardian breeds will do this, and all sighthounds will do this. You can't say that because each dog is an individual. And we should be saying, instead of each dog is an individual, so genes don't matter, we should be saying each dog is an individual because all of these things do matter. And it's that recipe, it's the beautiful puzzle piece, the mosaic of all of these different things that are contributing to the overall beingness and the behavior of the dog that we really need to be taking into account. Oops. Sorry about this, guys. I'm having some kind of a little problem here. Okay, I think we're going. So all these wonderful technological advances that make this conference even possible in the midst of a pandemic, but sometimes can confuse the daylights out of me. So anyway, an ethological guide to the 10 genetic groups of dogs. The way that I break these down is a phylogenetic approach. So it differs a little bit from like what we're usually, or what we're used to seeing in terms of like AKC breed groups and stuff like that. And you will be getting a simple overview for the next part of the presentation about the different groups of dogs. And these are them here. And there are some purebred dogs. People always ask specifically about things like Dobermans, Rottweilers, Dalmatians, Dachshunds. There are some outliers that have strong representation from multiple groups. So, for instance, Dachshund has strong genetic representation of Terrier and Scenthound, and so you'll behaviorally see strong elements of both. So just keep that in mind. Some don't fit so neatly. If you want a deeper discussion, I suggest buying my book. I think you guys would probably really enjoy reading it yourselves and then having it as a reference guide for working with cases moving forward. Because if you're working with a breed of dog that you've never worked with before and you're coming across some behaviors that you would like to understand a little more deeply in terms of the potential for ethological contributions to that behavior, it can be handy to look back at that and see what might be going on. Again with this, sorry. Okay, so one of the things that I think is really important to distinguish is the difference between aggression and ritualized aggression from an ethological perspective. So in nature, everything is kind of for a reason. In nature, everything has just this awesome, genius, checks and balances, self-correcting efficiency, economy that is just, it's miraculous. It's very impressive. And so when we look at things through the natural lens, then we can understand aggression and ritualized aggression as functional. So anything that occurs with any kind of frequency in nature overall, or even within a particular species, if it's represented at any kind of a high level, then there's something about that that's adaptive, that's functional. Now, of course, when we get into artificial selection, we might have decided that we liked a certain trait, and so we bred that more into the animal, but it might not be actually serving that animal's best interest. But because we're breeding it, reproduction being kind of the ultimate determinant of whether or not something is successful, when we're breeding animals, things can be successful that wouldn't be in nature. But let's start with nature's understanding. So going back to wolves and, the less genetically domesticated breeds of dogs, ritualized aggression is actually meant to avoid conflict. So in nature, true aggression, true altercation, getting in a knockdown, drag out, bloodshed argument with somebody is very risky for both, because there are no vets out in nature that are just going to sew up that wound for you, give you some antibiotics to go home with. So even if you win, but you come away severely injured, you could still die as a result of your injuries. Not to mention just the energy expension of getting into complete altercations is higher than ritualized aggression, in which we are, or the animal would be using displays, signals, threats in order to reconcile a potential problem. And so we need to be able to understand that from a ethological perspective anyway, ritualized aggression is favorable. And so in the less genetically domesticated breeds of dogs, we will often see higher levels of ritualized aggression, more utilization of ritualized aggression, and the higher level of inhibition against actual aggression. Or full engagement in an altercation. And so in some of the breeds of dogs, however, there were selective forces that favored full engagement of actual aggression and a inhibition even of the ritualized aggression and the signaling. And so that's just really important to understand as we move forward talking about this. Mike and I talk about whether or not like predation is actually aggression. We've had this argument back and forth just for fun, really philosophical argument judgment. And really, there's no right answer there, right? You'd ask the one who received the well-placed bite to the ankle, even if it wasn't meant to engage in full altercation, if that was something that began in predation to bring down prey, from its roots, then if food acquisition was the goal of the behavior, then is it actually aggression? And I think our clients will perceive it as aggression. Whoever's on the other end of that, small animal, the neighbor's cat, what have you, will experience it as aggression. But we might understand that it's predation. And so part of what we'll be talking about are the modifications to the predatory sequence that are different in the genetic groups of dogs, depending on the selective forces. So as we go forward and we talk about some of these different genetic groups of dogs, you'll see that we have a little bit of a key. We have the red is for hypertrophied or exaggerated components of the predatory sequence. The gray is for muted elements of the predatory sequence, and preserved is just, not tinkered with, so to speak, or still present in kind of a common sense in the predatory sequence for these groups of dogs. So we will be, for the sake of our discussion, lumping in predation into our discussion of dog aggression, because a lot of the behaviors that we see in dogs are modified versions of predatory behaviors that were functional in other ways, whether that be for herding or whether that be for blood sport entertainment. Historically, people wanted to see altercations between dogs and other large animals, and then at some point between dogs and each other, that are modifications to predation in some cases. And so it's just important that we can kind of lump it in for the sake of the conversation, but do understand that the roots of these behaviors often have very different sources. So again, this is kind of the key that we'll be using in terms of talking about the variations to the predatory sequence. This is an example of the complete predatory sequence. Scanning or seeking is kind of the pre-beginning of the predatory sequence. But so orient, eye, stalk, chase, grab, bite, kill, bite, dissect, and consume is considered the basic predatory sequence that most operate from. And this is an example of, say, the sighthound in this case, and the variations that were created in their predatory sequence from artificial selection. So first we will talk about the natural dog. The natural dog is the least genetically domesticated group of dogs. And there's a list of some of the breeds that are in this group. And and before I kind of go too far into all this, dogs that are mixed breeds, if they have a strong representation of one of these genetic groups of dogs, I consider that 30% or more, then it can be significant behaviorally. It doesn't mean it will be, but it can be significant behaviorally, enough that if I feel like I'm seeing morphological evidence of a particular genetic group of dogs, I ask the client to get a genetic test to confirm that. But it helps me have a good starting point for setting some expectations on day one. But if you have a mixed breed, it doesn't mean that all of this is rendered obsolete. So just because we have a half herding dog and a half guardian does not mean the two wash each other out into nothingness. It means we will probably have traits of both. So these dogs are some of the oldest in the world. Some of them are Asian in origin, and some are Nordic in origin, but they were kind of the first basal groups of dogs that were companions to human beings, and we found were functional in a variety of ways, helping to guard our territory, helping us find and locate and take down game, even as some coarse herding in some of these early breeds like the Samoyeds and whatnot, where it wasn't as fine-tuned as what we would see like in a Border Collie or an Australian Shepherd, but still some coarse herding behaviors that were useful, where some of those original natural dogs were genetically selected enough so that you wouldn't have follow through the predatory sequence completely with your livestock, so that you can operate and use that animal in order to help you in your agricultural aims as a human thousands of years ago. So think of this as kind of the base group. It's helpful to think about that they do have an intact predatory sequence, and so at least most of them, that would be the standard deviation. So, if you're looking at kind of what would be normal or what the intended selections were for a particular group, there was no selection against the complete predatory sequence strongly enough that you would expect that these dogs would not express a complete predatory sequence. But you might, again, in certain groups or certain breeds like a Samoyed, see a slightly muted version of a completed predatory sequence, or some individuals that don't express it at all. Again, variation is part of the game in nature, and so there can always be outliers and exception to the rules. These are not meant to be determinative. They're just meant to be starting points for talking about expectations and what the selections were intended for. So I'm not going to have the time to go into the deep dive of all these groups that I did in Mike's module. So I'm going to skip some of the longer, more in-depth discussion of each groups. But I do want to go ahead and be able to talk about some of the common labels that get put on each of the groups of dogs. So with this group of dog, we will often see a lot of client complaints of predatory aggression, resource guarding, stranger-directed aggression, social conflict, agonistic behaviors, and handling and restraint and defensiveness. And if you think about the fact that they're less genetically domesticated than many of the other breeds of dogs, it makes sense. If you took a wild animal, if you took a wolf, you would expect to see resource guarding as a normal adaptive behavior that, if it wasn't selected against, would still be present. And that's true for territory, that's true for social members, actual objects, protecting objects against strangers, and also protecting resources and objects even against other social members. Probably using a lot of ritualized aggression in that, and so you would expect to see that, here more than just the full-on knockdown, drag-out engagement of actual aggression in those circumstances. Again, you could see the whole range, but it would make more sense to see some of those resource guarding behaviors, but also see the ritualized aggression employed. Stranger direction aggression, so being wary of people that you don't know, or individuals that you don't know, or things in your environment that you aren't familiar with, is adaptive in nature. So if an animal is less domesticated, if these dogs are less genetically domesticated and neotenized, and therefore not selected to be as reduced in their aggression towards people or domestic circumstances, or as fearful of those things, then you would expect to see wariness at a higher level in this genetic group, if that makes sense. And so also, social conflict in general, you're going to have more same-sex conflicts between these types of dogs be likely because, again, the lack of the greater selection for neoteny and paedomorphism, which is the preservation of juvenile traits throughout adulthood, side effect of domestication and selecting for temperament and companionship and friendliness with people, makes dogs less socially competitive with each other, with other people, more passive, more tolerant. This is how you have more individuals be able to tolerate living in smaller quarters in higher numbers. And so it's part of the genetic selection for domestication. So again, with less of that, you would just expect to see more of these kind of original behaviors. Handling and restraint defensiveness, we'll see a lot of these dogs have trouble at the vets where, maybe one could get away with manhandling a golden retriever or a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, even, well-intentioned manhandling, intrinsic, necessary manhandling that occurs in a medical environment. But some of these dogs are going to take much more offense to someone that they don't know taking certain liberties and invading their personal space than other groups of dogs. So again, if we can understand that it makes sense for this group, we are going to approach it differently than we would maybe with other dogs, and understand it differently. So let's move on to the next group. So the Sighthound, also one of the oldest groups of genetic dogs, oldest genetic groups of dogs, and they were artificially selected for the job of hunting, originating in Africa and ancient Egypt and the Middle East. They were developed for, of course, and have the morphological representation of sensitivity to increased peripheral vision for scanning and locating at long distances prey opportunities. So, and then of course having the speed to acquire them. So in terms of predation, they do have an intact predatory sequence with a exaggerated chase, and with many of the groups of dogs that dissect and consume. It's kind of like you'll see with cats, these days. Like some cats will not dissect and consume things that they kill. They just like playing with them, and they'll go through the predatory sequence, and they won't actually dissect and consume it because they weren't really hungry. That wasn't what it was about. So the same is true for a lot of dogs, is that they won't necessarily dissect and consume it. Some will, but you'll see that that's muted on a great many of these regardless. Again, we have further selection for neoteny, for domestication, further selection against fearfulness of and aggression towards people, but yet less domestication than in some of the more modern breeds. We often will get the complaints with sighthounds of things like predatory aggression. So, there's a lot of warnings if people are adopting greyhounds about cats and other small mammals, for good reason, because that was part of the selection, or it was something we were utilizing these dogs for that was already present genetically for them, and we definitely did not select against. The guardian breeds, so let's talk about them. They were selected originally largely for livestock guarding, but were also used for guarding property and person, and then were some of the founding dogs for blood sport entertainment by the Romans, and used for pitting against other large animals like bears and things like that. And so a lot of the molosers and the giant breeds have that in their roots, and there are livestock guardian breeds that were particularly selected in that direction, and then there were others that were more specifically developed for being a dog of war, or a dog for blood sport entertainment, or a dog for protecting personal property and person. So there is, in many of these dogs, a very strong selection against the predatory sequence, particularly with livestock guardian breeds, because you didn't want your livestock guardian dog to kill your own livestock. That would be a really bad idea in terms of what we were wanting as a shepherd, and protecting our flock from other predators. So these dogs do have lower levels of dopamine anyway, so their chase is lower on the front end than it would be for other groups of dogs, where we have actually increased dopamine and arousal, excitability for them to motivate behaviors, herding dogs being a great example of that. And Ray Coppinger has some good information about that in his many books. But it's good to understand that for many of these dogs, we will not observe predatory behavior. We may see versions and piecemeals of emergent components of these, like an eye stalk in play, or some chase behaviors in play. But largely these dogs were selected for the behavior of resource guarding and being very wary about intruders to property, threats to the social group and the social members, threats to particular resources, and then to take action accordingly with courage, only when there was a severe enough threat that something needed to be done about it. And so we wanted a dog that would let a lot of stuff roll off of them, but when they needed to step up to the plate, would go in with full bravado. And that's very much a guardian. So oftentimes people will not observe as many of the warning signs. It's not so much that like the ritualized aggressive displays were bred out of this group, so much as the kind of lower dopamine and lower arousal has made them so kind of stoic and reserved behaviorally that sometimes it seems sudden when they do engage in an altercation, because it just takes more for them to kind of hit that threshold of that level of arousal, or a circumstance in which they feel an action needs to be taken. And some of those dogs, depending on the selections, do more threatening, where some do more full engagement, depending depending on the type of guardian they are. But I wouldn't be surprised if you have clients come to you with guardian breeds or guardian breed components, mixed breeds, with resource guarding behavior, territorial aggression, protective aggression of owner, stranger directed aggression, and then same-sex conflicts, between dogs. So all of that would be considered pretty normal for those types of dogs. So toy breeds, all of the kind of companion breeds, the lap breeds, literally bred to warm the laps of the nobility, going back to the medieval days and Renaissance Europe, and used for everything from being a flea magnet to an alarm barker, to a symbol of excessive resources where one could actually have an animal just as a pet, but literally bred to spend their existence in the life or the lap of a human being, and in close contact to and relationship with a person. So there's no particular selection for or against anything in predation here, but there's a high selection for neoteny. And all of the toy breeds carry at least one of the dwarfism mutations or genes, and some have three, like pugs have three. So it's important to realize that, like, really you have like a myriad of kind of dwarf versions of other types of dogs. So you might have, for instance, like a Cavalier King Charles Spaniel, which is a spaniel, but it's a toy, it's a companion breed. And so looking at that, you may see different flavors and versions and contributions from the other genetic groups in the toy group, because they're kind of like the dwarf version companion group catch-all that has contributions from all those different origins. So when you're looking at them, just know you can still see a lot of variation within them, with the commonalities being things like, high level of human centricity, much higher level of human dependency, and neoteny, so needy behaviors, dependent behaviors, solicitous behaviors, things that make them really enjoyable for people to have those close connections with and to live comfortably with in our modern environments. This is one of the groups of dogs that does better in our modern environments than most of the other genetic working groups of dogs, particularly because they were bred for these particular indoor environments, so they can be much more successful in them as a result. But we will see more things like separation anxiety, stranger directed aggression, and resource guarding, protective aggression of their person. They can almost like hyper attach themselves to a particular person, because they are so small. They can often be like overly fearful about things. I am not one of the people who thinks that like dogs are not aware of their size. I think, of course, they're aware of their size. It's one of the reasons animals size each other up. But there can be some compensatory kind of behaviors to the fact that they feel more vulnerable. So those are all things to keep in mind as well. So looking at my clock here, I've got like 12 minutes left, and I'm trying to boil all this down into an hour for all of you today. But we can all talk extensively after the fact, after this conference and upcoming events and conferences when we get back to normal. So the scent hound. So these dogs were derivative of guardian dogs and mastiffs that were first used for tracking, and then they were developed into their whole subgroup as scent hounds for just incredible ability to track prey by scent over long distances, and the kind of mark, the call to arms, the baying that we're used to hearing, where the phrase holding an animal at bay comes from. And so they do have an intact predatory sequence. At least it wasn't selected against, but we wanted these dogs to be full in engagement. It's just that oftentimes the things that they're chasing will escape them, such that they continue to bark while they're holding it at bay while the hunter catches up to them. But it also would not be surprising at all for a scent hound to completely engage in the completion of the predatory sequence with a grab bite and a kill bite. My beagle ate many rabbits in the time that I had her years ago too. So predatory aggression is often going to be one of the number one types of behavior problems related to aggression that we're going to see with these dogs. They also kind of wear their heart on their sleeve, bred for emotionalism, so can be a little bit competitive about things like locations, resources, things like that. But generally are one of the breeds of dogs that we see lower levels of aggression in in many ways. They can have difficult times in indoor environments, though, that's for darn sure. And barking is at the top of the list of most of the complaints that people will have about them. So the gun dogs, also one of the groups that is more well suited to a lot of our modern expectations, particularly when it comes to like sociability and reduced aggression towards strangers. Gun dogs were bred to work in very close cooperation with people. So they're very human centric, very human, deferring and cooperative, because the level of relationship, communication, and function, the complexity of that needed to exist in order for gun dogs to do their job was very high. So we wanted to have a type of dog, spaniels, retrievers, setters, pointers, etc., that would have an exaggerated orient and eye, and then a stalk that froze. And I got this wonderful video. I wish I could upload it into this now, but we don't have time. And I'll share it maybe on Mike's Facebook or something after the conference. But I'm renting a house right now, temporarily while we're between houses moving, where they have a English setter. And I got a 7-minute video of the dog stuck in the orient eye stalk, and it just stopped. Like you could see the muting of the chase. The dog was just 7 feet away from a rabbit, stuck, setting, which is exactly what we wanted out of these dogs. We didn't want full engagement. We wanted them to show us where it was and then move just enough to flesh it out so that we could shoot it. And so that's why they're called gun dogs. But it's a really impressive modification to the predatory sequence. These dogs were not bred for any particular type of aggression. They have been selected for temperament for a very long time and human companionship. If anything, they can have a high level of frustration from too confined of indoor lifestyles and environments, which can result in aggression for a variety of other reasons, but they were not selected for any particular type of aggression. Terriers, on the other hand, were. So before we all had like pest control companies that we could call to eradicate our homes and farms of things like rats and mice and foxes and badgers and all of these things. We needed someone to help us do it, and dogs have been historically very helpful for that over the course of many years. So terriers, bred for particularly focusing on different types of varmints historically, were bred to be a very high arousal, high dopamine, high excitability, ready at the drop of a hat, anytime any varmint would enter the scene. They are bred for a strong orient to notice those things. And then it's almost like they just skip the eye stalk. It's not so much that it was, intentionally muted out, but you wanted a dog that was so quick to the fire, so quick to the trigger, because that little rat, you just got a moment when it skitters across the little kitchen floor for that dog to notice it, hear it, see it, what have you, and be on it like white on rice, and engage in full chase, grab, bite, kill, bite. Just immediately. They're very efficient killers. So that gameness was a selective force for the terriers indeed. So we often will get complaints of predatory aggression, and because they just are bred for such like all in, skip the filter, get turned on and aroused, in it to win it, 100%. They can get into some trouble with some resource guarding, some agonistic social conflict behaviors with other dogs, just kind of because they're quick to the trigger. But also bred for being highly sociable with people. These dogs tend to be pretty jolly, pretty happy-go-lucky in a variety of situations. At least that was the selective force. That was the intention. And so they needed to live in close proximity with people. And so you have this interesting kind of contradiction of like a high level of neoteny, but also this high level of engagement. It kind of brings about the recollection of the old Scrappy-Doo with let me at him, let me at him. It's kind of the personality of the terrier in terms of what we were selecting for, we, figuratively, humans, historically, as we were breeding. So you might see some of these types of behaviors emerge and create some problems for some of your clients. Now, the bulldogs are an interesting separate group that didn't arise really until about the 14th, 15th, 16th century in England. But there was a time where and of course we talked about the Mastiffs or the guardian breeds and the Molosers being used by the Romans, going back even further. Blood sport entertainment was an unfortunate, and is persisting still, an unfortunate thing that humans really like to observe, and pit animals against each other and wage wager large sums of money to see who wins. Pretty disgusting, but true nonetheless. So the bulls were particularly developed from Molosser Mastiff type dogs. And then they were crossbred with terriers in many of the bull breeds in order to increase the gameness. And so it's interesting because the guardians present kind of an erasing of the predatory sequence. And so with some of the bulls, you'll see little to no predation at all, and much lower levels of dopamine. You can almost see in the morphology, like the heavier bull breeds tend to be lower arousal and have much lower drive for predation and conflict and things like that. But they might be a little more protective because you're getting more of that guardian representation genetically. Whereas the dogs that have higher level of kind of the terrier contribution are going to be those zippier bulls, the ones that are higher arousal, also like really fun and jolly and energetic and into turning your, living room furniture into a parkour course. And, that's the kind of the terrier contribution. But so we do see a huge range in bulls. We see dogs that don't predate at all. We see dogs that do predate. We see dogs that are protective. We see dogs that are not protective at all, and like golden retriever level of sociability with anyone or any dog that would come into their house. And so that's really important to realize, is that there's just a huge variation out there with this genetic group. And yet at the same time, one thing that they tend to have in common is that the goal of the bulls was, once engaged completely. And there was a selection against, honestly, any economy of behavior or even self-preservation, because, the bulls were bred to take on an opponent that far outsized them. So with the original bulldogs, for a bulldog to be set upon an animal that outweighs it times, 20 or something, and hold on for dear life and not let go, it doesn't make good sense. There's no kind of natural adaptive force that would have created that kind of behavior. And so what we tend to see then is less use of the ritualized aggression, because particularly when it comes to breeds of dogs that were used for fighting against each other. So once bull fighting was outlawed in England, dog fighting became more popular, and they started fighting dogs against each other more. If you think about it, if the whole purpose of ritualized aggression is to prevent an actual altercation, and the whole purpose of dog fighting is to create an actual altercation and have the dog win that actual altercation, you want, if you're a fighting dog breeder, to select against ritualized aggression and select against the warning. So I think it's one of the reasons that we see these dogs, like people say, oh, they just flip, they just turn, it's like a switch, and then all of a sudden they're like Jekyll and Hyde. It's not really. And if you know that, if you know what it was for, you'll be better at seeing the small indicators, particularly the environmental conditions that could set that up. Because once these dogs engage in a conflict, it is often kind of like a horse out of a gate, and it's all in it to win it. And it's not intention, it's not trauma, it's not fear, it's not bad experience. It's just genetic software behaviorally informing the behaviors of the dog in a particular context, that, like the instincts and the habits we were talking about that go back that far in a reinforcement history, when it's genetic, it skips the filter, it skips frontal lobe. It has nothing to do with intention or even necessarily a contextual stimulus of like not liking that particular dog or something. It could just be the way the conditions set themselves up is that of an altercation, and the dopamine is high enough that the dog decides to engage, and once engaged might use less ritualized aggression and higher levels of actual aggression. Again, not predictive. Just because people were intending to breed for this doesn't mean that every bull is going to have no ritualized aggression and all actual aggression, or any aggression at all for that matter. These dogs, as you all know, are less commonly aggressive than other breeds of dogs. It's just we hear more about it because the cost is often higher. If they do engage in aggression, the injuries can be more severe. And really that's just about like engagement level. It's not even like the locking jaw myth and stuff like that. It's just about engagement. And so, don't go into working with bulls animals with this sense of, well, oh, they're all going to, do great damage and they are aggressive, because nothing could be further from the truth. It's just important to understand that we might not see as many clues leading up to incidents, and we might see more injury once incidents occur. And we shouldn't blame the dog as abnormal if that happens. We might still have to make very difficult decisions about whether that animal is going to functionally be able to live in a human environment, but it's not something that the dog is choosing, and that's one of the things that I do think is important about talking about genetics, is that we have to get away from blaming the people or the dog, or even thinking the dog is a lemon. We have to think, actually, that's just kind of an effect of what people have been breeding these dogs for doing for years. And that poor dog didn't ask for these genes, but he might have them nonetheless. And then we're in a predicament where we have to kind of, deal with how are we going to manage against the circumstances that are going to give an opportunity for that behavior to be expressed. And then herding dogs, we've just got very few seconds here left, of course, have a highly modified predatory sequence, because you cannot have your herding dogs preying upon your livestock. So we have a very strong orient eye stalk chase with a highly inhibited grab bite, and a complete erasure of kill, bite, dissect, and consume, because you might have some grab bite, say with cattle dogs in the herding group, but really there's a strong selection against full engagement of the predation. There's my little alarm. So I'm going to be trying to wrap up for you guys here. You will probably see a lot of resource guarding, territorial aggression, protective aggression, stranger-directed aggression with these dogs. Largely because they are bred to notice and respond to sudden environmental contrast, which, if you think about all the things in the environment that can create sudden environmental contrast, to then release, these releasing stimuli to then release herding behaviors, which is, chase, bark, snap, lunge, try to bite, so to speak, try to reach. It looks like aggression, but a lot of it is just misfiring herding behavior. And so we see high numbers of complaints about aggressive behaviors in herding dogs. That's really not any intention to harm anyone or even to resolve a conflict, so much as it is to, it's just skipping any intention at all. And it's going from just a stimulus to a response of, say, a fast moving sudden object occurs, and then the dog does something to act out towards that event in the environment that seems aggressive. But these dogs also were bred for a high level of sociability with people, and a high level of companionship and responsiveness to human instructions. So that provides a real opportunity for helping to work with those behaviors when we do observe them. The world dogs are still what 80% of the world is populated by. These are dogs that are living and cohabitating in human environments. Go to third world countries, go to Mexico, go to Argentina, and observe these dogs coexisting with people. Honestly, if you love watching dog behavior, nothing is more fascinating than just sitting back and observing how these dogs navigate their environments. Got a great video when we were in Mexico with Mike of a dog in Valle de Bravo that was just traveling around doing his thing, and we just followed him around for about an hour and a half, my husband and myself, and it's just fascinating seeing what they do. But so anyway, the world dog is kind of like, the uninfluenced or less influenced dog of the world. So going back thousands of years, there are the original world dogs, and world dogs are adapting and changing and different in any country, any different town, depending on the pressures and the opportunities and the circumstances there. But basically, it's when nature gets back at the helm of the breeding, and artificial selection from humans is no longer at the helm of the breeding. So if you have a dog that's mixed up enough, nature's driving the breeding again. So if you do a DNA test and it's a little of this and a little of this and a little of this and a little of this, well, then nature's picking who's reproducing with who and what's working and what's not. At least in most of those cases. And so then you're getting more of these, kind of whatever is adaptive, whatever makes sense. These dogs tend to not have any particular kind of common aggression, other than maybe if they are in a third world country, some wariness of people in general, just depending on their own experiences. But genetically, they're actually much more flexible and would have had a strong selection against aggression, because it's going to reduce their likelihood of surviving, particularly autonomously in those environments. So barely here, right at an hour. It looks like I'm just under 60 minutes, Mike. I think I pulled it off. It really matters that you guys factor ethology into your work. It can be overwhelming. There is a lot of information out there about ethology and all the contributing scientific disciplines of evolutionary biology, neuroethology, neurology, genetics, epigenetics. All of these things are going to contribute to a real applied ethology perspective of working with any animal. And for us, of course, that's dogs. And I really want this not to feel like it has been a comprehensive or exhaustive discussion as an introduction for you to ethology, but more of a launching off point for what I hope will be the beginning of a journey where you find so many more answers in places that you hadn't been looking before. So thank you all so much for attending the conference and watching this presentation today. I definitely suggest that you do some further research on your own. I was good friends at the end of his life with Raymond Coppinger. I was fortunate enough to get to know him in his last few years of life. He wrote the foreword to my book. And, you know, as far as I'm concerned, is kind of the father of, you know, the ethology contribution to our understanding of dog behavior. We really got to bring it back, and we got to continue to look at the people that have been contributing things to our understanding from that perspective. So here's a few other folks that I suggest you guys look into. There's a number of studies and references in the back of my book, and you can also find more stuff there. Here's a few different links if you want to go and do some more research yourself there. But thank you all so much. And sorry I couldn't see you in person. Let's hope next year, after this whole pandemic is over. Take care.